Maintenance doesn't access the main corridor today. Show me your work badge, now. I worked into the CEO just for legal reason to block me.
The morning of January 6th, 2020, started the same way most mornings at Caldwell City Hall started. The cleaning crew arrived before sunrise. The floors were mopped while the fluorescent lights still buzzed at their lowest setting. The hallways smelled of industrial lemon and floor wax. The security desk near the main entrance was staffed by a single officer who had not yet finished his coffee. The building was quiet in the way that large government buildings are always quiet before the public arrives, a kind of institutional stillness, where the architecture itself seems to know it holds power and does not need to advertise it. Marcus Webb had walked into that building more times than he could count. He had cleaned the council chambers on late Tuesday nights after sessions ran long. He had replaced the light bulbs in the third-floor offices when no one bothered to file a maintenance request. He had buffed the marble in the lobby so many times that he knew which sections caught the morning light and which sections stayed dull no matter how hard you worked them. He knew this building the way most people only know their own homes, intuitively, quietly, without ceremony. He walked through the employee entrance that morning carrying a garment bag over one arm and a cardboard coffee cup in his free hand. He was wearing a plain gray Henley shirt, dark work pants, and boots that still had scuff marks on the left toe from the previous week. He had not yet changed. The inauguration ceremony was not scheduled to begin until 10 o'clock, and it was not yet 7:30. He had come early because he always came early, because he had spent 22 years of his life arriving before everyone else. And some habits do not disappear simply because the circumstances around them change entirely. He was walking toward the staircase at the north end of the lobby when the first officer stopped him. Officer Dale Pruitt had been assigned to the Caldwell City Hall security detail for 4 years. He was broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, the kind of man who made every interaction feel like it was being evaluated for a potential threat. He stepped into the center of the hallway with his right hand resting at his belt and said, loud enough to echo off the marble, "Hey, where do you think you're going?" Marcus stopped. He had heard that tone before. He had heard it in parking lots and grocery stores, and once at a school board meeting when he had tried to sit in the front row. He recognized the particular combination of authority and assumption that sat behind those words. He set his coffee cup down on the ledge of a nearby window and said, calmly, that he worked here. Pruitt stepped closer. ID. Marcus reached into his back pocket and handed over his city employee identification card, the kind with his photograph, his name, and the municipal seal printed in the lower left corner. Pruitt looked at it for a long time, not the kind of long that suggests careful reading, the kind of long that signals deliberate disrespect. He handed it back and said, "That's a maintenance badge. This floor is restricted this morning. You need to be in the service corridor." Marcus said, simply, that he was aware of the events scheduled for this morning. Pruitt said, "Then you know maintenance doesn't need to be in the main lobby before 10. Go around back." There was a second officer near the security desk, Officer Brian Calloway. He was younger, maybe 26, and he had been watching the exchange from the moment it started. He had not moved from his position, but he had set down his coffee. His eyes were tracking the situation with the relaxed attentiveness of someone who expected it to resolve itself in a particular direction. Marcus looked at Pruitt for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup. He said, still calm, that he would need access to the third floor this morning, and that he had a specific reason for being in this part of the building. Pruitt said, "I don't care what reason you have. I'm telling you where maintenance goes. Go around. Back, I'm going to need you to leave the building entirely." This was not a gray area. Marcus had presented identification. He had stated that he worked in the building. He had not been disruptive, had not raised his voice, had not made any gesture that could reasonably be read as threatening. The order to leave was not based on security protocol. It was based on a gray Henley shirt and scuffed boots and the 22 years of context that a man's appearance can carry when certain people decide they already know his story. Marcus did not leave. He said that he needed a moment to make a phone call. Pruitt said he had 10 seconds to start moving toward the exit. What happened next was captured on 3 separate cameras. The lobby's fixed security system, the cell phone of a city administrative assistant named Darlene Okafor, who had arrived for work early and was standing near the elevator bank with a clear sight line to the entire exchange, and a handheld news camera operated by a local reporter named Jamie Solis, who was setting up for pre-ceremony B-roll footage and had been rolling for 6 minutes before the confrontation began. Pruitt placed his hand on Marcus's upper arm and began physically steering him toward the east corridor. Not a grip that could be mistaken for guidance. A grip that communicated ownership of the situation, that telegraphed clearly to everyone in the lobby who held authority and who did not. Marcus's coffee cup hit the floor. The garment bag slipped from his shoulder and caught in the crook of his elbow. Calloway moved from behind the desk and positioned himself on Marcus's opposite side. 2 officers, one man with a garment bag and a spilled cup of coffee. Darlene Okafor pressed record. Jamie Solis adjusted his angle without lowering the camera. Pruitt said, loud enough now that his voice carried to the far end of the lobby, "You are being escorted out. Do not make this difficult." Marcus said something that none of the cameras caught completely. The audio is partially obscured by the building's ventilation system. But Darlene Okafor, who was close enough to hear clearly, later told investigators that Marcus said, very quietly, "Do you know who I am?" It was not a question delivered with arrogance. It was not a challenge or a provocation. It was a statement made with an almost surgical calm, the kind that only belongs to a person who has decided, in that precise moment, that the question deserves to be answered by someone other than himself. Pruitt said he didn't care who he was. They had him at the door when it opened from the other side. Her name was Patricia Huang, and she was the incoming mayor's chief of staff. She was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a blazer over her dress that she had not yet fully buttoned, because she had parked 3 blocks away and walked faster than anticipated. She was already reaching for her phone as she came through the door, and she looked up mid-stride and stopped moving entirely. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. For seconds in which Patricia Huang looked at Marcus Webb, then at Pruitt's hand on Marcus Webb's arm, then at Calloway's position on his other side, then back at Marcus, who was looking at her with an expression that carried no surprise whatsoever. As if he had already calculated, somewhere in the quiet machinery of his long experience with this particular kind of moment, that this was precisely how it would end. Patricia said, "What is happening?" It was not phrased as a question either. Pruitt, still not releasing his grip, said that he was escorting an unauthorized individual from the restricted lobby. Patricia said, "That is Marcus Webb." Pruitt said he understood that, and that maintenance personnel were directed to the service corridor this morning. Patricia said, with a stillness that preceded the kind of words that tend to follow people for the rest of their careers, "Marcus Webb is the mayor-elect of Caldwell City. He is being inaugurated in this building in 2 hours and 23 minutes. And you have your hand on his arm." The grip released. Calloway stepped back. The sound of his boots on the marble echoed in the way that retreating sounds always seem louder than advancing ones. Pruitt stood where he was. He did not apologize. He did not speak. He looked at Marcus the way certain people look at information that contradicts everything they believed before they walked into a room, not with remorse, but with the particular discomfort of recalibration, of realizing that the story you told yourself about a situation was not simply incomplete. It was the inverse of reality. Marcus Webb reached down and picked up his garment bag from the floor. He did not look at Pruitt. He looked at Patricia, gave a small nod, and walked toward the staircase at the north end of the lobby. Darlene Okafor stopped recording at 1 minute and 47 seconds. She stood for a moment looking at her phone screen. Then she went to her desk, sat down, and uploaded the video to her personal Twitter account with a single line of caption. She was not a journalist. She was not attempting to make a political statement. She described it, later, as the only honest response to what she had just watched. She said, "I just had to tell somebody what I saw." By 9 o'clock, the video had been viewed 300,000 times. By the time Marcus Webb stood at the podium in the main hall at 10:17 and placed his left hand on a Bible that had belonged to his grandmother, the number was past 2 million. The ceremony was brief and formal and attended by city council members, local clergy, community leaders, and approximately 300 residents of Caldwell who had worked, in one way or another, to put this man in this room. His speech lasted 11 minutes. He spoke about public service as a form of devotion rather than ambition. He spoke about the gap between the laws written on paper and the laws practiced in the halls that held those papers. He did not mention the lobby. He did not mention the officers. He stood at the podium of the building he had cleaned for 22 years, and he spoke about the city the way a person speaks about something they love enough to hold accountable. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when people are listening with their whole bodies. Outside, in the lobby below, Officer Dale Pruitt was still on shift. The footage spread the way footage spreads when it contains something that a large number of people simultaneously recognize as significant. It was not viral in the frivolous sense. It was shared by people who attached their own experiences to it, who said, in comment sections and group chats and around kitchen tables, that they knew exactly what they had watched because they had lived adjacent versions of it. The video traveled through networks of people who had been told to use different doors. People who had been asked for identification in spaces where no one else was asked. People who understood, without narration, what the garment bag meant, what the coffee cup on the floor meant, what 4 seconds of silence in a marble lobby can contain. The Caldwell Police Department issued a statement that afternoon. It described the incident as a misunderstanding and noted that officers had followed standard security protocols for restricted city events. It did not name the officers involved. It did not use the word apology. It used the phrase regret the confusion twice in a document that was 11 sentences long. That statement was read by 5.4 million people by the following morning. It performed, in the public conversation that followed, roughly the opposite of its intended function. By Wednesday, the Caldwell City Council had formally requested an independent review of the police department's conduct protocols. By Thursday, the NAACP had filed a civil rights complaint with the State Attorney General's office. By Friday, 3 separate attorneys had contacted Darlene Okafor about the legal implications of the footage she had recorded, not in pursuit of a lawsuit, but to ensure that the footage itself was preserved and authenticated in anticipation of proceedings they all considered inevitable. The department's Internal Affairs Division opened a formal investigation on January 9th, 3 days after the inauguration. The investigation was not initiated by the police chief. It was initiated by the city's new mayor, who had the authority to direct it and the institutional knowledge to understand exactly where to look. What the investigation found took 11 weeks to fully document, and the documentation ran to 218 pages. What it found was not limited to the morning of January 6th. The inquiry into Pruitt and Calloway's conduct on Inauguration Day opened a structural review of their full service records, and what those records contained was not the profile of 2 officers who had made a single, isolated error in judgment. Pruitt had accumulated 9 prior complaints of racially discriminatory conduct over his 4-year assignment. 3 of those complaints had been filed by city employees. 2 had been filed by residents attending public hearings at City Hall. 4 had been filed by individuals Pruitt had stopped in the immediate vicinity of the building. All 9 had been administratively closed without formal action. Calloway had 2 prior complaints, both filed within his first 18 months of service, both closed at the supervisory level before any formal review was initiated. The person who had closed 8 of those 11 complaints was Captain Richard Haley, who oversaw the City Hall security detail and had held that position for 6 years. Haley was named in the investigation. The Attorney General's report, released on March 28th, was unambiguous in its language. It described a pattern of racially discriminatory enforcement. It described the administrative closure of complaints as a systematic suppression of documented misconduct. It described the conduct on January 6th as neither isolated nor accidental, but as the visible surface of a pattern that had been operating and being protected for years. Pruitt was terminated on April 2nd. The Caldwell Police Department's review board found that his conduct on January 6th, combined with the documented history of prior complaints and the pattern identified in the Attorney General's report, constituted grounds for dismissal. He did not contest the termination through department channels. His union filed a grievance on his behalf. The grievance was heard and denied. Calloway received a 6-month suspension without pay and mandatory retraining. The review board noted that his conduct on the morning of January 6th, while inappropriate, did not carry the same documented history as Pruitt's and concluded that his case warranted remediation rather than dismissal. That distinction was contested publicly by several civil rights organizations who argued the board was applying inconsistent standards to equally documented conduct. The debate continued past the scope of the formal proceedings. Captain Haley was removed from his supervisory position on April 14th and placed on administrative reassignment, pending a separate disciplinary proceeding focused specifically on his closure of prior complaints. That proceeding concluded in June with a formal finding of supervisory negligence and a demotion to patrol assignment. He retired 4 months later. None of these outcomes were generated by a single moment of public outrage. They were generated by a process that moved slowly and required documentation and formal complaint filings and legal pressure, and the kind of sustained institutional attention that does not happen on its own. What put that process in motion was a man who arrived at work early, had his arm grabbed in a marble lobby, and held enough institutional authority by 10:17 that morning to direct an investigation into the system that had just tried to remove him from his own building. There's something in that sequence of events that takes a moment to absorb fully. Not the dramatic irony of it, though that is real and visible and was the primary reason the video spread the way it did. Something underneath the irony. Something in the specific quality of patience required to walk into a building you have cleaned for 22 years, be grabbed by an officer who has decided without evidence that you do not belong, and respond not with explosion, but with a quiet question. Do you know who I am? Not as a weapon, not as a performance, as a statement of fact deferred to a later moment, delivered not by the man himself, but by the circumstances he had earned through a life most people never saw or thought to ask about. Marcus Webb had grown up in the southeast quadrant of Caldwell, in a neighborhood that did not appear in the city's promotional materials. He had graduated from Caldwell East High School and enrolled in community college for 2 years before his mother's illness made consistent attendance financially impossible. He had taken the custodial position with the city at 24 to maintain health insurance coverage for his family. He had held that position for 7 years, during which time he completed his undergraduate degree at night, earning a BA in political science from Caldwell State on a part-time schedule that took 5 years instead of 4. He had attended every city council session that was open to the public for the better part of a decade. He had run for city council himself in 2014 and lost by 400 votes. He had run again in 2016 and won. He had served 2 terms on the council, building a record focused on affordable housing, police accountability, and municipal employment equity. He had announced his mayoral campaign in 2018 out of a rented community room on Halstead Street, in front of 43 people, most of whom he knew by name. He had won the general election in November 2019 by 11 points. None of that was visible in his gray Henley shirt. None of that was legible in his scuffed boots or his garment bag or his cardboard coffee cup. None of it was asked about. It was not considered relevant by the officer who put his hand on his arm and told him to go around back. That is the part that does not require elaboration. That is the part that the video communicated without a single word of caption or explanation, which is why it traveled so far and settled so heavily in so many people. Not because it was shocking, because it was familiar, because the decision Pruitt made in that lobby, the decision about who belongs in which spaces, about what a person's appearance authorizes others to assume about them, is not a decision that originates in individual officers. It is a decision that systems make quietly over a long period of time and then distribute to the people working within those systems until it functions like instinct. Until it happens in marble lobbies at 7:30 in the morning before anyone has finished their coffee. Until it is so ordinary that it requires a camera and a chief of staff walking through a door and a mayoral inauguration and 2 million views and an attorney general's report before it produces a single consequence for the people who enacted it. On April 15, 2020, Mayor Marcus Webb signed into law the Caldwell Municipal Accountability Act. The legislation established an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena authority over the police department's internal affairs division. It required mandatory public reporting of all complaints filed against sworn officers, including their resolution status. It eliminated the supervisory-level closure mechanism that had allowed Haley to administratively bury 11 documented complaints without formal review. It created a municipal employment equity audit office, the first of its kind in the city's history, tasked with reviewing hiring, assignment, and disciplinary practices across all city departments on a biennial basis. The signing ceremony was held in the main hall of City Hall, the same room where the inauguration had taken place. The same marble floors, the same fluorescent lights buzzing at their institutional frequency. Marcus Webb signed the legislation with a pen given to him by Darlene Okafor, who was standing in the second row. He did not make a speech. He had said what needed to be said in the 11 months leading up to that signature. He looked at the pen for a moment after he finished, set it on the table, and looked out at the room. Outside, down the hallway, past the lobby where the coffee cup had hit the floor, past the window where he had set it down while a man with his hand on his belt decided in the span of 3 seconds what kind of person Marcus Webb was, the marble floors caught the morning light the way they always had. Dull in some sections, bright in others, unchanged by everything that had happened above them and around them, the way floors tend to be, the way buildings tend to be, patient, indifferent, waiting for whoever comes next to decide what they mean. The system does not reform itself. It reforms when the people inside it document what they see, stay in the room, and build something that will still be standing after the cameras move on. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.